I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome back, or welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by the Gold Coast Marathon and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, sports and exercise physiotherapist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll aim to bring you a range of different episodes, including featured performers, interest editions, coaches corner editions, and expert editions. And on today's episode 161, I share a recent conversation I had with returned Physical Performance Show expert edition guest, Associate Professor Dr. Peter Malliaras. Dr. Peter Malliaras first featured on the Physical Performance Show around about 100 episodes ago on episode 62, where Peter shared around all things tendinopathy or tendon rehabilitation of the lower limb. To date, it's been one of the most downloaded expert editions, and here we are 18 months on, and I felt it pertinent for Peter to share updates on all things tendinopathy rehabilitation and to further some of the great sharings that Peter outlined in episode 62. By way of bio, Dr. Peter Malliaras is an associate professor at Monash University, where Peter leads various research tendinopathy projects and supervises PhD students. Peter's also a practicing clinician at Complete Sports Care in Hawthorne, Melbourne, Victoria, where he consults with patients who have had enduring, persisting tendinopathy injuries and also elite athletes. Globally, Peter is a respected and leading tendinopathy researcher, having co-authored well over 55 peer-reviewed publications that mostly relate to tendinopathy. Peter is one of the key voices that I turn to help dispel the world of research into practical and real-life clinical practice. And I know that just like Peter's first appearance on the show, you're going to get so much out of Peter's sharings on this expert edition. Make sure you have your pen and paper at the ready. And tune in as today, Peter answers an expert edition performance round around common, frequently asked tendon injury questions. Peter outlines the framework that he uses when rehabilitating tendon injuries. Peter shares around what a good rehabilitation program entails. Peter will outline the mistakes that practitioners and patients alike can make when attempting to rehabilitate their tendon injuries. We explore tendinopathy rehabilitation principles such as how to know when too much is harmful or when not enough may be deleterious. There is so much in this episode. If you are experiencing pain and limitation from a tendinopathy or you know someone who is, then this is an expert edition you are not going to want to miss. So here is my conversation with Associate Professor Dr. Peter Malliaras. This is an absolute thrill to have one of the most popular expert edition guests return for a second time on the Physical Performance Show, Associate Professor, Specialist Tendinopathy Physiotherapist Peter Malliaras. Thank you for joining us once again.
Thank you very much for having me, Brad.
And we should point out right now you're in a lab environment, an imaging facility as part of your ongoing work, correct, for research?
Yep, exactly. I'm basically hiding away at the back of an imaging facility in the centre of Melbourne, where I'm conducting a trial. So we're looking at injections. We might get onto some of this later on, but a new injection for Achilles tendinopathy. So basically, this is my office for today.
And the risk of not getting back to that, maybe let's cover that up front. So what's this trial looking at, and why does it matter in the management of of what we know as tendinopathies?
Yeah, so look, injections are one of those things where, like with many areas, we don't have a lot of evidence, and we don't have injections that we know work very well, particularly when you compare them to comparisons like placebo. So the issue with that is that a lot of patients actually are recommended and get injections. So some people would say that is okay because, as long as we're not doing any harm, it's, even if they don't get better, it's not the end of the world. But others would say it's not a good practice because potentially we're harming patients by giving them injections that are either going to delay their recovery or for some people could actually make them worse. And we know with steroid and other things it can potentially make them worse. So what we're researching is a new injection. It's called a high volume injection, and basically it's a large volume of saline. You stick it in between the tendon and the fat pad, and it is meant to mechanically separate those tissues. And one of the theories is that you get a lot of ingrowth of nerves from the fat pad that could potentially contribute to pain in Achilles. So that's sort of the theory behind it. No one's done a big trial on it. We've got some government funding to do a trial with almost 200 Achilles patients, and we'll start recruiting in the middle of this year, I believe. So yeah, look, it's an exciting trial. So maybe if people are, it might be a bit early, but good opportunity to try and drum up some interest in terms of recruitment. But that will be going in the middle of the year, and we're basically looking for people who have maybe had some exercise but have not improved when they've done exercise.
Yeah, and certainly, and so this will be kicking off middle of 2019, and Peter, clinically as a practicing physiotherapist, specialist physiotherapist, have you seen any, clinical good outcomes with this so far? Obviously, the trial hasn't been conducted yet.
Yeah, look, I was very lucky to work with a guy called Dr. Otto Chan, and he's a radiologist in London, and he's actually on an aeroplane right now, heading over here to train the radiologists here on this high volume technique. He invented the technique in London, and he's been doing it for about 15 years now. I worked with him for 2 years, basically as his sidekick. And what I mean by that is every person that would get the injection, he's got a pretty good life, Otto Chan. He works Monday, Tuesday, or he did when I was there, and that was it. The rest of the week he had off. He's also got 7 children. He's a great guy. So basically he would work like solidly doing these injections on Achilles patients, and we'd see, maybe 30, 40 Achilles patients in 2 days do these injections, and then I would do all the rehab and follow-ups with them. So that was great experience. And look, and that's part of my motivation for doing this research. I do think they offer something, but as a physio who believes in exercise, and I do believe that vast majority of people can get better without injections, that's for sure. But for some people, they really struggle. The question that I think is an important one and a good one is, can we get people better faster if we offer some sort of injection? But we can't really be offering that and be looking at that unless we know that these injections, first and foremost, are safe. Now, the thing that I should mention about the high volume injection is it does have high volume of saline, but it also has local anesthetic and steroid in it. So what we're testing is whether if you take the steroid out of that cocktail of drugs, does it actually have a lesser effect? But perhaps if we look long term, and we're looking up to 12 months, is the effect actually superior in the long term? Because one of the things, and your listeners might be aware of this, one of the things with steroid is the long term effects are very much thought to be negative. So that people have, and this is based in some of the evidence that is out there, the impression that in the long term, if you have steroid, you might actually, be worse off. So that's an important thing to look at. So
I guess summary, there's still a lot of unknowns, hence why you're leading a research team on this. And, when we recorded for episode 62, Peter, your key bit of advice to listeners was for anyone that was frustrated with a tendinopathy that didn't seem to be responding or wasn't responding as fast as they would like, was to do your exercises very well, focus on quality, and try to understand your condition based on the premise that if that wasn't done, then people can panic, practitioners and patients alike, or people alike, and look to other things that, as a passive, fix for it. So I guess your thinking probably hasn't changed, but you're starting to explore other modalities as a potential mechanism to improve things faster. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd say that's the case. I would, stand by a good rehab program. I think it's very, very uncommon that people who do a very good rehab program don't get better in the long term. The problem is that long term can be 6 months, it can be 12 months for some people. Funnily enough, I bumped into a patient because it's at Olympic Park here, the facility in Melbourne. It's quite a big sports medicine precinct, and bumped into a patient who I hadn't seen for 2 years here, just getting a scan for something else. He's got a quads issue now, he's a footballer, and he said to me it's the first time his Achilles has felt good, and it's taken him he's been doing stuff for a year and a half. Haven't seen him for a while since I set him up with a program, but this is the thing with these things, it takes ages. It takes a long time, and some people are not willing to wait that long. The other thing is, in a sporting context, people always look for shortcuts and always look for ways of getting back to peak performance faster. So I don't think we can ignore injections, and as a scientist, I'm interested in learning about their efficacy and safety, because I think we owe it to our patients, because they will, regardless of our advice, not every patient is going to listen to you when you say, you know what, just do your exercise for a year, you'll be right.
Yeah.
It is a tough sell.
Yeah, and as you say, in elite sport or, recreationally competitive sport or even just day-to-day function, we do struggle with patience. And I recall the story that you shared of one of your most recallable patients that you'd had when we recorded in episode 62, and that was that this was a young tennis player with patellar tendinopathy, and it took around 2 years, I think you cited at that point, for that gentleman to get back to pain-free tennis.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So that's hardly palatable but for most people. But so, Peter, in terms of, you used the phrase there, a good rehab program.
Yeah.
What are the constituents to a good rehab program across, in general, tendinopathy?
The most important thing is to make sure that it's individualised. So it's no good giving someone, say, a lot of patients will, read up on. I had a patient recently, he read up lots of papers. He's actually a sports science lecturer himself, read up lots of papers, did the eccentric program, and just absolutely cooked himself, got much worse with it. He was doing 70 kilos of eccentrics on one leg in a Smith machine. But he had a very painful and irritable Achilles tendon, so that made him worse rather than better. And that's the thing, you can pick a program that's evidence-based, but it's individualising it to the person, so knowing what level of load to start with, knowing that you need to progress to a significant amount of load, but you've got to do that in a gradual way, and you've got to respect symptoms. So I think I think the formula is pretty simple, and it's just progressive load, respecting pain, but it's knowing how to start that process and how quickly to adjust it, so how quickly to keep on progressing and keep on adding load, and how to keep on reassuring patients who feel like maybe they're pushing too hard, or reassuring patients who feel like they don't want to push because they're fearful. So it's finding those balances and those nuances in how to progress the load that I think is the most important, and then it's actually convincing patients to do it. Because, let's face it, it's bloody hard work doing rehab for, 3-4 times a week for a long time. And committing to something like that is difficult. So, the first challenge is getting them on the right path of understanding the problem and knowing how to progress and knowing how to exercise. Then the second problem is actually, making sure they actually do it, they follow through for long enough to actually see results. So I think those principles and those factors by far transcend in importance the type of exercise you do. So, who's to say whether you just give someone isometrics for 6 months, they're not going to get better? We just don't know that. Who's to say whether just doing isotonic for 6 months, i.e. up and down exercises, they're not going to have a similar response? I sort of believe load is load as long as it's progressive, because really you're never going to train someone for the specificity of sport unless they're doing sport. So really what we're trying to do is get rid of pain and make them as functional as possible. So that's sort of... I don't think we know enough about the type of exercise, but we know that we need to progress these people over time, get them as strong, as tolerant to all the loads they need to do as possible. And that covers all the, usually it takes the form of isometrics when they're really painful, get into some, good strength work, which usually involves, the whole rehabbing the whole leg and looking at sort of, really good heavy load strength, and then going on to some, energy storage. So this is where the tendon, acts like a spring and starts to store energy, which often is very painful for people early on, and that could be hopping and running. So that's sort of what it usually looks like, but it's just a progressive load input. So I guess that's a good way to summarise it.
Yeah, so that's, just to recap, that's, the constituents, if you like, of a good rehab program. It's individualised. People understand how to progress and respond to symptoms as they go. And then, instilling the adherence. So I guess realistic expectations about what they can expect in terms of timeframes and activities required. As you say, there's a multitude of ways to add load to someone's sore tendon, but it doesn't matter unless someone's doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's terrific. Peter, on that progressing load and someone who's experiencing a tendon pain, let's say it's an Achilles tendon, what are your key tips in terms of what would you normally do in a consult, for example, to educate someone on this concept of acceptable and unacceptable pain? Peter, how do I know if I've done too much?
I usually start by saying, look, the Achilles tendon is a very strong and robust structure. It's the strongest tendon in the body. It is very tolerant to load. It's very hard to rupture an Achilles tendon. You need to, it's not something that I try and avoid. I try and educate my patients not to be concerned about those types of events happening. They are very, very rare, and often we know that people who have pain are very unlikely to rupture their tendon. So that's reassuring. I think the thing that patients struggle with is they have an idea that their tendon is fundamentally weak when it's painful. So I think the most important education messages are to really reinforce the strength of the tendon and the fact that having pain in the Achilles tendon does not relate to the integrity or the strength of the Achilles tendon. That's very, very important. So once they disassociate those two things in their mind, and that is the integrity and strength of the tendon as pain, then they are much more likely to engage with allowing some symptoms and all of the rehab messages. So then you go on and you talk about, okay, some context to that, and this is where it gets a little bit, debated, I guess, and different people have different views, but basically they people say, okay, let's give some context to pain. It's okay to feel a little bit of pain. Okay, how much is a little bit of pain? Well, who knows? It's hard to define, but usually you'd say 2 or 3 out of 10 or less, or sometimes up to 5 out of 10. Other people say we should never use a number. It should just be whatever is acceptable to the patient. So it's that's where there's a little bit of, and I sort of. I sort of agree with the latter, where we should think about what's acceptable to the patient. However, for some people, it is helpful to give them a number to say, look, this is where you should be aiming for. So then starting to give some context to, this is what you should be feeling, and not above that. And the most important thing is how they recover. So how do they feel the next day? Is that, is it, and the easiest way for patients to conceptualize this is your pain getting worse and worse and worse day on day or over a period of time? And you can measure that with something consistent, like, what is something that always gives you pain every day? Just measure that, monitor and see how that is progressing over time. So I think the pain fear construct is the most important one to tackle. We did some research recently, and my student has just submitted this for publication, where we looked at psychological measures on about 91 patients. And these are all patients that just came through the clinic where I work, and they're all old limb tendon patients. And we found by far the most prevalent psychological factor was fear avoidance. And we looked at things like anxiety, depression. We looked at coping and other things, and we found by far the most prevalent thing that people reported was they were fearful. And that makes complete sense. I mean, it's quite normal to be fearful if you've got a painful tendon and you're thinking, it might rupture or something bad might happen. So I think where it becomes a problem is when it really interferes with people's progress. And that's where the education, I think, is really important.
So much there. Certainly as a full-time clinician, I've just observed when you spend the time educating someone about their pain and what it does and doesn't mean, they almost feel liberated, I think, and they get a glimmer in their eye of like, oh, wow, okay. I think there's always publicised sporting cases of ruptured Achilles tendons that, you can see with sometimes high-profile players, etc. And I think everyone's heard a bad news story of that. So distilling that fear is so important. So, Peter, we've touched on a good rehab program, some of these constituents. Since we last spoke, are there any further advancements in the tendinopathy field at Broad? I mean, your gift to the world of, I think, healthcare is distilling the evidence down into really practical things that clinicians and patients alike can adhere to. So what would be the key things that have changed in the last 18 months in the world of tendon rehabilitation?
Look, we did have every 2 years we have a big tendinopathy conference, International Scientific Tendinopathy Symposium, and that was in Groningen, which I definitely couldn't pronounce before the conference. So it's more sounding like Groningen, which is a town, a very, very nice town in the north part of Holland. And so everyone gathers there, and we had a really good session. We did, one of the key things that came out was a consensus. We had an expert group of about 30 people from around the world who had some interviews to do, some surveys to do, and then we met up and we discussed consensus on terminology. Because as you know, there's lots of different terms different people use, like tennis elbow versus lateral elbow tendinopathy. And I think it's important moving forward for patients and researchers and clinicians to be consistent. We talked about the key outcomes that we should measure. So we talked, and this was really interesting research. And it does transcend to clinical world as well. And that is if you've got an Achilles patient, what is important to measure as an outcome. So we've come up with 9 key domains, and they are being published in BJSM. I think they might be in the pipeline, not quite published yet, but things like pain, function, physical activity, psychological factors, all these domains are things that are important to consider if you've got someone who's got an Achilles problem. So that was, or any tendon problem, that came out. There was lots of, there's still lots of debate and discussion about the significance of pathology. So that's a real interesting area. So, the question of can we actually improve tendon pathology with exercise, or does it improve and heal over time? That is still a open question. And there's been lots of groups looking at things like UTC, looking at other imaging modalities like elastography, and trying to understand more about that. And I think that has some huge implications, because generally, if you haven't got a tendon pathology, you haven't got tendon pain. So it's in our best interests as a clinical and research world to determine whether we can heal, and if we can, to try and optimize healing of the tendon. We've always thought of this as being something that might be difficult or impossible, and certainly the continuum model paints a picture that it's probably impossible at a certain stage, like the degenerative tendon. But and I think that's true. But we're probably learning now slowly that maybe there are chances to remodel and heal more than what we thought. And that's just some very early, and that sort of fits in with what I see clinically as well. Because using ultrasound in the clinic, I tend to have the really good fortune of seeing some people over years, like, for example, the tennis player that you brought up earlier. I saw him, I still, intermittently see him, but I remember seeing him once for his opposite Achilles tendon, opposite patella tendon, which was painful, had become painful, I think 2 years after his other one was better. And I rescanned both tendons and was really surprised to see that the now non-painful tendon, which he'd spent 2 years rehabbing, and he still rehabs, is almost, much improved from an ultrasound point of view. So I think we've got a lot to learn about tendon healing, and that was one of the themes of the conference. Disappointingly, there's not much new stuff in the exercise world, but we're doing some interesting stuff which I'm happy to talk about briefly at some point, and that's trying to understand load parameters and how they influence healing. So that was sort of the main bits of the conference there, the main new areas that I think people are working on.
In the work you just mentioned there, Peter, that you're working on load parameters and how they influence healing. What are the headlines there? So
I've got, I've got a PhD student who's just finished a pilot feasibility trial. So she has randomized people to 4 groups. One group was high load and high time under tension. One group was low load and low time under tension, and then we had the other 2 combinations, so low load and high time under tension, and high load and low time under tension. So it's a factorial design where you have 4 groups and you're looking at 2 factors, and the factors were time under tension and load. And she's just finished recruitment, and she's got 40 patients that have finished the trial. She's got another 8 to collect the 12-week follow-up on. So that's the first trial that we're aware of that has tried to control exercise parameters. What other trials previously have done, they have compared just very different exercise programs. So, for example, a well-known trial in the Achilles tendon is the Bayer trial from 2015, where they look at eccentric training versus the heavy slow resistance, and they find that they're both comparable in terms of outcome. The issue with something like that is Well, the benefit of something like that is it tells you that these two exercise programs probably work. The issue is you have no idea of why they work. For example, is it potentially the load? Is it the time under tension? Is it the duration? Is it other factors? So what we're trying to do, and I don't think anyone else, as far as we're aware, has attempted this, is to look at parameters that actually confer greater benefit when people are doing these types of exercise interventions. So I think that is a step forward for trying to understand, what we should. So if a patient walks in and says, "Look, what exercise program should I be doing for this?" At the moment, you can only answer, really, look, there's a number of exercises programs available and they all seem to be quite similar. This is what we think is important, i.e. do it for a few weeks, make sure it's progressive, etc., etc. But you can't really advise it with any certainty on any of those parameters and what actually works. So that's what we're trying to understand. What we have realised is that is very difficult research to do, because you're relying on patients to actually do what you tell them to do from an exercise point of view. So what we've done is we've had weekly Zoom tele-rehab interventions where we've monitored their exercise once a week over Zoom. So I had something like 8 physiotherapists in the community who were following people up every week via Zoom. Now that's 48 people by 12 weeks, lots of sessions, over 500 sessions of Zoom we had to coordinate, which was just an absolute nightmare in terms of getting people to do it and commit to it, and people would last minute just reschedule, and it was really difficult. But we've pretty much managed it. It'll be very interesting to see what we find over the next few weeks.
Yeah, so there's lots of work going on, and I guess that's in the scientific community, which then hopefully underpins clinical practice, i.e. where people go and seek the opinion of a health professional to help them on those practical matters. Peter, Achilles tendons, tendinopathy, gluteal tendinopathy on the side of the hip, and say proximal hamstring tendinopathy. As you say, it's how do we set the parameters of the exercise prescription? Well, your first point of a good rehab program was it always needs to be individualised. So keeping that at the fore, what would be some of the key mistakes that you see people making across these, say, 3 common tendinopathies? So Achilles first. What are the key mistakes people make, both people and practitioners alike?
In a rehab context, there's mistakes around the type of rehab you do, and that is often you find that it's not progressive enough. So it's not progressive enough, so loaded enough. The other one is you can often find that people are getting a bit too fancy with their rehab. So what I mean by that is they tend to progress to very functional, very high-level things very early. So that often, without doing the basic things to really develop load tolerance. So that's another thing. I really believe in, and this is a really ongoing debate with a lot of people in the exercise world. I really believe in isolated is probably the wrong term, but as specific as possible load to that structure. So looking at an Achilles and trying to load it as much as you can to develop tolerance in the first instance before you progress on to running and jumping and things that are going to load it in that sports context. So often people will not appreciate, I think, how much specific load targeted to a structure can help pain and tolerance over time. But then the balancing act of that is not doing too much of the things that are going to cause pain whilst you're doing that. So one of the things that I keep learning in my career, I've learned over and over again, is you've got to appreciate that they have to not rest, because rest is sort of, a word that now has a lot of negative connotations in these types of conditions, because you don't want people just to do nothing at all, but you want them to allow their pain to settle down. And that's another rehab error. People just, it doesn't matter what rehab you do, if you're not going to allow things to settle, it's just not going to work. And then probably the other area is not. The other thing that I find in clinic is people not progressing to the or recovering power. So with runners that need to get back to doing powerful activities, they will need to often have some sort of input to recover power, and that could be hopping or jumping. So that's another common error. And then lastly, you often find the education, so the stuff we've talked about already, so the education that goes with the rehab, that is just not sufficient to allow someone to take on the confidence and say, right, this is what I need to be doing. So they're sort of, I guess, the main things.
You're listening to this expert edition featuring Associate Professor, Specialist Tendinopathy Physiotherapist, Dr. Peter Malliaras, sharing around all things Part 2, Tendinopathy Rehabilitation. Support for today's show comes from the Gold Coast Marathon. Just like the Physical Performance Show, the Gold Coast Marathon encourages runners of all ages and abilities to push their boundaries and strive to complete a personal challenge. The Gold Coast Marathon is held annually on the first weekend in July, and it's a must-do event for any budding athlete, weekend warrior, or family looking for a challenge to complete together. Run for the good times at the Gold Coast Marathon. Visit goldcoastmarathon.com.au. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio. We exist to help you get back to your physical best following injury. We want everyone who walks through the doors of Pogo Physio to complete their rehabilitation, get back to their physical best, and in doing so, cross their physio finish line. We do not want to see you for a single session more than what you need to get back to your physical best. We just want to ensure that you get there. To find out more about Pogo Physio's services or to schedule your 1-hour initial appointment, jump over to pogophysio.com.au. For now, let's jump back with Associate Professor, Specialist Tendinopathy Physiotherapist, Dr. Peter Malliaras, on this, a Tendinopathy Rehabilitation Expert Edition. Specifically on the fancy rehab, and I've learnt this through your Master in Lower Limb Tendinopathy course that I did several years ago, and I'd say I've had relatively good success in the isolated loading of different areas, say the calf Achilles complex with Achilles tendons. What are the benchmarks that you sort of have in your head for the different areas? So, if you're setting someone up with loading in the gym, for example, in a calf raise machine, what are the loads that you sort of like to see reached for, say, the gastroc and the soleus, so the two components of the calf musculature? So
with the calf, we do have pretty good understanding now. I am sort of becoming super specialised in the Achilles tendon. It is seeming. So I tend to get a lot of Achilles, but I think about 70% of my patients these days are Achilles. So I work on a Wednesday from 8:30 till about 7:30, and that's my only one day in the clinic, and I see a lot of Achilles. It's seeming just naturally to sort of happen like that. I do see, a spattering of the other lower limb tendons and a few shoulders and elbows, but so for the Achilles, I've really been able to, with research and with the clinical work, get a better feel of where people need to be, and we are looking at, in a seated calf raise, getting them to at least their body weight for a 6 repetition maximum. So that's with the bar on their knee. That's not with a seated calf raise machine where the weight is significantly more forward than that and that will make it harder. So generally the conversion's about, if you've got a seated calf raise machine, 40 kilos would be at least double of what you're going to be pushing if you're doing it in a Smith machine with the bar right on your knee. So that's an important consideration. I always advise patients use the Smith machine. I think it's a better machine, better movement, but also it's also more able to be relatable between contexts. Like Smith machines will pretty much all be the same, whereas if you're using a seated calf raise machine, all the machines will vary depending on the mechanism and the momentum. So that's sort of for the seated. For the standing, we would tend to look at someone who's a recreational athlete getting to at least half their body weight. And say you've got a sprinter or a track athlete, they'll probably get to their body weight doing a 6 RM. And that's additional to their body weight, obviously. So that's their body weight on the bar. So that'd be about the Achilles ranges.
And that's the that we should point out, that's single leg too, Peter?
That is all single leg, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's great. And then, what about something like the hamstring, proximal hamstring tendon? What are the benchmarks you sort of adhere to with your own clinical practice for those? The
proximal hamstring, generally, you would be looking at on a leg curl machine, around about 15 to 20 kilos generally, but they will all vary depending on the leg curl machine. So again, our leg curl machine, and this is what I always talk to patients about and physios when I'm teaching. It's basically really dependent on the machine. So I know that I can take someone to our leg curl machine, which is a lying down leg curl machine, and basically if they haven't got 15 kilos of push for a 6 RM, then they're probably weak. But some patients go away, they can do 15 kilos on my machine, they come back a few weeks later and they say, I can't even do 5 kilos on the gym machine. So they vary a lot. So I think you've got to be mindful of that, but just have some sort of idea of where you think it is at for your device that you're using. As some patients will start off with a hamstring problem, and this is I've just rehabbed a masters athlete who did really well in the nationals that just passed last weekend, and he had a terrible hamstring problem, and he was the most, talking about adherence, which we've touched on today, he was the most dedicated person I've ever come across. He was in the gym, because we get people to use the gym in our clinic, and I'd seen there all the time just doing his hamstring rehab. Ended up going from not able to shift 4 kilos, which is the lowest rung on our Smith, on our leg curl, to pushing 38 kilos, and that was in 6 months, which is pretty amazing progress. Pretty much the highest progress I've ever seen. But this guy did not miss a day for 3 months, basically, 3 times a week.
Yeah, it didn't miss a day, as in he went 3 times a week versus every day. So, yeah. There's a great example of adherence. What about the patella tendon, Peter? Any benchmarks you like there?
Patella tendon, looking at a leg extension, around about 40, 50 kilos for most people. Some people, really tall guys, will get to 60, 70 kilos if they weigh about 100. So it's, ratio to body weight, it's probably just over half your body weight for most people. But that's also variable based on machine. Yeah,
single leg once again, and that's 6 repetition max, yeah?
RM, yeah.
Yep. And then gluteal, tricky one. So what would be sort of some guidelines for the gluteal benchmarks, if you like, in terms of restoring the capacity to that area?
Yeah, gluteal is a tough one. Basically, it's hard because there's a number of challenges with the gluteal. One is you can never independently test one side compared to the other, because if you take them into, say, a hip abduction pulley machine, and then you basically do one side, you've already worked the other side that you go on to test. So it's hard to know which side is weak sometimes. And again, you've got to have your you've got to have your set amounts of load that you think is acceptable. One of the things that makes it a bit easier is a pulley machine. So I get them into the pulley machine and would look at least the pulley machines are good because the plates are often around 2 to 3 kilos. So one plate is 2 to 3 kilos. They should be able to do 4 to 5 plates, and athletes could do more than that. So people should be able to push 10, 15 kilos. So you should get most people up to that level. And that's just doing a hip abduction, a slow 6 RM hip abduction. And, again, you're going to be sort of working both sides. So you want to make sure that you're giving them lots of rest between sides. But that's what I would use for gluteal.
And that should be in the standing position, yeah, with the pulley.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. No, fantastic. Peter, I know they're broad guidelines, but helpful nonetheless. Thank you. In terms of what to do when someone seemingly gets stuck with rehabilitation, so assuming that the adherence is there, they're doing the work, they're not fearful of their pain or any of the mistaken beliefs, as a clinician, it can even be at times, does the direction get changed, or do we stay the course and continue with building the capacity back and returning to activities? I normally find the latter is the right direction, but what would be your advice to clinicians alike and patients that just feel like, I'm doing the work, I'm understanding how long it will take, I'm patient, but it just doesn't seem to be changing. Now, there's a myriad of ways. I know this is a difficult question that you could answer this.
Yeah, look, it is a difficult one. It's frustrating. It's really frustrating when you've got a patient, as you say, and they're doing all the right things and they're coming back in, and you're sort of hoping for some, a breakthrough or some improvement, and they're just not getting anything. It's a difficult one because the inclination for most people is to say, right, we're going to offer something else. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to try and improve this and shift it a bit faster. But I think you're right in that if you stick to your guns and you make sure everything is done well, over time, if everything is as it should be, they will improve. And I think the reassurance of telling them that is very powerful. And I go back to the tennis player that you brought up earlier, because he's by far the most extreme. I mean, he's just a outlier in terms of how long he actually put up with me and I put up with him and he put up with his rehab, because that was, beyond what most people would do. But it just taught me from that case. He had injections, multiple injections, shockwave. He'd basically had everything. There was nothing left but surgery and rehab, and he really didn't want to have surgery. And we sort of both learned that you can do 18 months of rehab. He was back to tennis earlier, but it took him a long time to get back to top level, and he persevered. So I do believe that time is the key factor for a lot of people. So not adding anything is okay, but not everyone has the luxury of waiting for that long, and therefore we do need to be aware of that. I would suggest the following. I usually suggest going to see a local sports doctor and getting an opinion about some medications that could help them. So this could be stronger anti-inflammatories. They usually have tried anti-inflammatories, but getting them some stronger anti-inflammatories, or an injection at some point to see whether that makes a difference. Shockwave is something that I use a lot in the clinic to try and also shift pain. Any modality you can get your hands on, but by that stage you've probably already tried the tape and the shockwave and hands-on manual work, and the patient has maybe had some benefit from that, but not completely as a long-term improvement. So it is difficult, and I think a lot of counselling and reassurance is necessary to keep people, going and committed, basically.
Were there times when you doubted with that young tennis player? You said you learnt that, and so did the tennis player, that 18 months, 2 years was required. But were there times where you were like, oh, do we change direction here or not? Yeah, no, for sure. There was definitely times of, reflection and thinking, this is, because we would have some wins which kept us, in the game.
but then would have setbacks and would have wins and setbacks. And that's sort of how the course usually goes. You have some improvements and then you sort of get knocked back again with some things that happen. So that's, whenever you have a setback, you sort of start to think, right, is this ever going to happen? What else can I add, basically? After a while, you feel, because this guy would have seen me at least, I reckon, 20 times over 2 years, 1.5 to 2 years. And, there was a lot of times when I said to him, look, we've got to stick to our guns. There's nothing else we can do. So, and it's paid dividends for him now. He's able to, he's competing at, top level tennis, and he's on the tour and doing stuff. But he, certainly we both had doubts, and he would come to me. He'd come to me with his dad sometimes, and, his dad would be asking questions about, is this the right, where's this going type thing. And, there's a lot of, for clinicians as well, you sort of feel like handballing on. And I did handball on a few times. I got to see sports doctors in the area just to say, look, can we at least put some reassurance in, or can we add something else? What else can we add? But they took one look at him usually and basically agreed that he's had everything. The only thing we can do is continue on. Medications in the short term and keep on going, basically.
You're listening to Associate Professor Dr. Peter Malliaras sharing around all things tendinopathy rehabilitation. If you missed last week's episode, a featured performer episode, then you missed hearing from the US half marathon record holder in a staggering 59:43 and America's first marathon runner to run sub 2:05 across the distance, retired US running dual Olympian Ryan Hall. Here's a little snippet of what you missed.
I love these marathon simulations that we used to do in marathon training. So we run like up to 12 miles at a medium hard pace, so about 1 minute per mile slower than goal marathon pace. And then we come back, we change into our flats, and we go straight into 12 miles at goal marathon pace. I love running long and hard, and that was a long and hard workout.
To tune into the full episode featuring Ryan Hall, jump over to wherever it is that you get your podcasts and enjoy the full episode. You'll find the Physical Performance Show on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and Stitcher, or any of the platforms that are available. For now, let's jump back on this expert edition with Associate Professor, Specialist Tendinopathy Physiotherapist, Dr. Peter Malliaras. Peter, let's do some rapid fire questions. So featured performers get put under the performance round challenge, and I'm going to throw them at you as an expert edition. So these are what I'd say common or frequently asked questions about tendons. 1, is cortisone bad?
We don't know. I'm going to be a real researcher. We don't know, but the jury is definitely out. There are people that believe it's definitely bad. There are people that believe it is not bad and do a lot of it, and that's why I think it's a real health priority to actually understand whether it is bad. It is bad if you have a lot of it, I believe. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and I know I threw it's a challenging game, this one, Peter, for a researcher and a specialist physiotherapist. I appreciate it. Just tell
me if I'm cheating, Brad. Tell me if I'm cheating.
I think you're abiding by the rules very well. We can make them up as we go. 2, people get told to monitor the 24-hour response. Why am I monitoring a day later versus straight after the activity?
Generally, with tendon pain, you will find out the next day is when things will start to manifest. So you'll start to feel that symptoms are worse after. So you don't necessarily get a lot of pain when you're doing things. Some people do, but often people feel that it gets better when they're doing activity. And the next day, that's when you learn if what you've done has been too much.
Great. 3, is this bump on my Achilles tendon bad?
Is this bump bad? No, not necessarily. But having said that, the bump is usually there to stay. So if you've got a bump, it doesn't necessarily get better, or it may get marginally better over time. Where it is or could be a problem is when you've got a bump and you haven't got any pain, because we know those people sometimes go on to rupture their Achilles tendon, and that can be more of an issue. Not to alarm people, but some people do come in. You get the odd patient who comes in and says, "Look, I don't have any pain, but I've got this lump. What do I do about it?" I usually just put them onto a good progressive rehab program, and that hopefully will mitigate the risk of rupture.
Yeah, great. And number 4, can't I just have shockwave to fix this?
Well, the short answer there is no. The shockwave will probably help for some people, maybe about half the people, their pain, but for most people, it doesn't give you any more than short-term relief. Some people, look, there's always going to be, you're running with someone. There's countless times when someone's come in to me and said, "Right, I want shockwave." My running partner at the club, he's had shockwaves and it fixed it in 3 sessions, and that's you're always going to have those stories. And then that's an anecdote, but by and large, from what we know from the evidence and also from my experience, it's not going to be the fixer for unfortunately most people.
No, great. And final question, Peter, in this expert performance round here would be 5, and you've touched on it already, but I guess just to bring all your thoughts together, 5, am I at risk of rupturing my tendon because it's sore?
What we know from the evidence there is that the risk is very, very, very small. So you don't have to worry. I've said to thousands of Achilles patients, your risk of rupture is very, very small, and so far, no one has come back saying they've ruptured their tendon the next week, or even actually one person sort of did. He had a sore Achilles tendon and then went on to get a partial tear when he was walking the Camino. But so it does happen, but the risk is very, very, very negligible. It's far less than 1%. So the risk that you're going to rupture your tendon, people with pain, less than 1% of them overall as a group, on average, will rupture their tendon, and usually that's when it's been interfered with. So the answer is no to that one.
Fantastic. Peter, well done. You're out of the performance round, and we're drawing to a close of our time together. You've been very generous with your knowledge and your time, so appreciate that. Peter, in the running world, there's been some recent high-profile examples of runners, Shalane Flanagan and Galen Rupp, both US athletes, receiving, well-publicised surgeries for their patella tendons, and also Galen with his Achilles tendon. Is it just the pressures of professional sport and trying to get people back that you think lead to those? Or, what are your thoughts? The average runner will look at that often and be like, well, if the top end of town get that done, maybe that's what I need.
Yeah, look, I think there is a lot of that, and that is the an environment where something needs to be done and done quickly, and often surgery is perceived to be the top level, the best thing you can do, the thing that's going to fix it, rightly or wrongly. And it might also be that you do a lot of other things that are positive, like the exercise and everything else, and people get better. But we all know of examples where surgeries of elite people have gone really badly, and some that have gone really well. So it's really not. It is the environment, and there's no guarantees. Doesn't matter who you are having surgery. There's no guarantees that it's going to work, and I think it's a risk strategy. But having said that, for some people it does work. Now, and I reflect on this with my tennis player. If he had surgery, would he have had a shorter or longer outcome? That's a question that you really. And that's probably the reason why they have surgery. Patella tendon is one of the most stubborn tendons in an athlete. They are very hard to manage. Like this tennis player and many other people that I've had, they can take ages, and it often really stuffs up someone's career if they've got 2 years out of competing. So I can understand it. And I think once you've got to a certain level, I think it's it is an option for sure.
Yeah, no, thanks for adding context to that, Peter. Finally, to wrap up, you issued one piece of advice on episode 62, so it'll be a little bit fun to see what the sole piece of advice would be to someone out there experiencing a tendinopathy at the moment. The date of recording, 2019, would be. So what's your one piece of advice going to be, Associate Professor Peter Malliaras?
I would say at this stage, don't panic. Don't panic. Do the simple things well, and try and get some progressive load into your tendon.
That is so well said. Don't panic, do the simple things well, and get some progressive load into your tendon. Peter Malliaras, thank you. And where can we follow you? I mean, you're prolific across the research world. I guess practitioners probably have all subscribed to Tendinopathy Rehab, jumped over there, which is great. The Talking Tendons podcast, which I always enjoy hearing go live, which is between 10 and 15 minutes, a snippet of some research that you've been absorbing.
So it's all that stuff. The main thing. So yeah, I guess the tendinopathy.rehab.com website is the main thing. But I am doing a series of courses in the UK, and that is in June. So I'll be over there for 3 weeks. So if you look on the website, there's dates for that, and there's also dates for the Sydney course is coming up. There's a Melbourne one in a couple of weeks, which is 3 weeks, which is sold out, but there's a Sydney one in August. So that's all the upcoming stuff, but it's all on the website there.
And on social at Tendinopathy Rehab over on Instagram, and at Dr. Pete Malliaras over on Twitter, and we'll hook up all the links in the show notes as well. So Dr. Peter Malliaras, Associate Professor, Specialist Tendinopathy Physiotherapist. We should add maybe Achilles Tendinopathy Physiotherapist by the sounds of it. But thank you for sharing once again.
Thank you very much, Brad. Thanks for having me. Thanks a lot.
So there you have it, another expert edition of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust you took a lot away from Dr. Malliaras' sharings today. Two things, if you did, be sure to reach out, let Peter know. You'll find Peter over on Twitter at Dr. Pete Malliaras, Malliaras, or on Instagram at Tendinopathy Rehab, or jump over and peruse the great resources over at tendinopathy.rehab.com. They will be also linked up in the show notes over at Pogo Physio. Secondly, if you know someone who would benefit from Dr. Malliaras' sharings today, then be sure to share this episode with them. A massive thanks to you, the listener of the show. Without your support, there would not be a show. And a huge and further thank you to those who have left reviews over on iTunes. This week, a big shout out to show listener Woody2511. Woody commented, recently discovered but have been listening non-stop since. Brilliant insight into the lifestyles, training and mindsets of Olympic and world-class athletes. As a swimmer myself, I seriously loved Andrew Lauderston's interview. Would be great to hear from a legend like Jeff Hugel on his comeback, or Nick Darcy on his side of the story. Love the podcast. Woodsy, thank you for taking the time to leave that review. It means a lot. And certainly listeners, if you have any feedback on how to improve the Physical Performance Show, do shoot me a message. I'm readily found over on social media at Brad_Beer on both Instagram and Twitter. Big thanks also for hitting subscribe to the show. It really is the single best way to help the show grow and reach more listeners also pursuing their physical best performance. Massive thank you to the three good folk who make the Physical Performance Show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Oldin on all things show graphic design. Of course, another huge thanks to today's show sponsor, the Gold Coast Marathon. Podcasts are certainly free to download, however, they are not free to produce, and the Gold Coast Marathon support means so much in helping to produce this show. And if you're truly looking for a great mid-year event down under here in Australia, then really look no further than the Gold Coast Marathon. It is on my calendar each and every year. Select from a great range of events, ranging from the junior dash right through to the full feature-length marathon. Jump over to goldcoastmarathon.com.au. Finally, if you're into running and would like to explore injury-free and faster running, then be sure to check out my running bestseller, found wherever good books are available. You Can Run Pain-Free, now in its second revised and expanded edition. But as a faithful show listener, If you would like to receive 50% off the recommended retail price of You Can Run Pain-Free, you can do so by jumping over to pogophysio.com.au, clicking on the shop, ordering the book, and simply entering the promo code POGO, capital POGO, 2019-2019 to receive the 50% off the recommended retail price. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we jump back over to a featured performer, and I bring to you a recent conversation that I had with rising New Zealand triathlon star Hayden Wilde. Hayden has been a double world champion at the under-19 level in the Xterra race. He has a nickname, the Maltese Falcon, has been a standout performer as part of the Super League Triathlon Series, and he's really stamping his mark on the World Triathlon Series. Caught up with Hayden and his coach, Craig Kirkwood, when they were both on the Gold Coast recently. You'll really enjoy Hayden Wilde. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.